In this video, what I want to do is take time to illustrate Becker's allocation of time model with the circular flow diagram and a couple other renderings. And this will hopefully bring together what we studied in the last video. Okay? So first thing I want to do is refer back to the circular flow that we saw in Chapter 1, or at least in the Chapter 1 videos. If you recall, there were households here, and there were firms. Right here, I'm just abbreviating. And households and firms interact in two markets. There's the resource markets down here, which labor is a part of, and there's the product market up here, which is goods and services, that kind of thing. And the way it works is households take their labor market time, as Becker calls it. They supply it to firms who then turn that labor, along with other resources, into goods and services, products, that they then sell to us. Okay, we're the suppliers of labor market time, they're the demanders, and they are the suppliers of goods and services, and we are the demanders. Of course, according to Becker, households, they have their own allocation of time outside of the labor market. So we're going to see that flow over here. And we know that that's household time as well as consumption time. Those two together make up the household allocation. And we're going to think about this as almost like a little firm of its own, a little household manufacturing plant, right? We can go to work, of course, and get the money to buy goods and services to bring to the household, but we can also use our time in the household in order to produce our own goods and consume those goods. A little manufacturing plant here. My artistic abilities are very limited, so just go with it. And we also learned that in this process of allocation, household time and consumption time, we specialize in a comparative advantage. So I'll just put that down here to kind of highlight how the different household members would specialize. Of course, what are we really doing this for? Why are we going to work? Why are we using time in the household? Because we want something, and what we want are utility yielding commodities. The things that yield happiness, right? And we thought of those utility yielding commodities in terms of those that are time intensive, okay, and those that are good intensive. Time intensive, if you recall, had a high amount of household time and consumption time and a low amount of labor market time. So I'll just put here high household time and low labor market time. Okay. Remember, growing a garden, making a meal at home, taking your time to enjoy it over candlelit dinner or something like that. A lot of time, right? But not so many goods and services that you had to buy to make that happen. In contrast, the good intensive commodities are the opposite. Here, you're going to have a very high labor market time and a very low household time. Okay. Should put household and consumption time. All right. And we also learned that when you have an increase in wage, it's going to create an income and substitution effect. We can see that in this model as well. So you can go down here and say, what happens when the wage goes up? Well, obviously, as wage goes up, it becomes more valuable to go down here, right? And if you're going to use time down here, you're going to have to give up time here. But it's not always obvious because there's two effects, right? What I just described is the substitution effect. But let's look at both effects so we get the full picture. The income effect, higher wages lead to an income effect. And that income effect leads to an increase in income. As the wage goes up, income goes up. Surprise. And then that leads to an increase in consumption. But what? Normal goods. And normal goods are just any goods that go up with consumption. Well, in this model, Becker assumes that leisure, is a normal good. And as a result, we're going to want to take more leisure. But more specifically, this increase in leisure is actually going to be reflected as more consumption time. And with more consumption time, that means less labor market time. And with less labor market time, clearly, that's going to be a decrease in the quantity of labor supply. Okay? Go to work less. That one's not so obvious as the wage goes up, but it is an important aspect of analyzing the decision making. Now, the other effect is the substitution effect. Let's go up here. As we'll say, the substitution effect leads to an increase in the opportunity cost of leisure. And that increase in the opportunity cost of leisure leads to a substitution towards more labor market time and less, leisure, but specifically household time and less consumption time. Again, I keep reminding us that household time and consumption time in the Becker model is leisure time in the prior model. So he's just nuancing it out a bit more. So it's the same effect as before. Substitution effect of a higher wage leads to higher opportunity cost of leisure. So people move away from leisure towards more labor, but more specifically, they end up allocating away from household time and consumption time. Well, as they do that, we're going to see an increase in the quantity of labor supply. So you have wages going up, and those higher wages down here, you're becoming more valuable in the labor market, is causing almost this polarizing response. On the one hand, you want to substitute away from this household, get into the labor market so you can produce goods and services and buy all the stuff you need. But on the other hand, this higher wage is making you think, well, you know what, the higher income, I want to enjoy the things that I can now afford, and so I'm going to need more consumption time, and as a result, I am going to work less. You're being pulled this way by the substitution effect, you're being pulled this way by the income effect, and the net effect is going to depend on the magnitude of each. Some people work more, some people work less from a higher wage. Okay, so hopefully that helps you more visualize the Becker model. The next thing we're going to talk about is labor force participation rates. We already learned what a labor force participation is, but let's detail it out and kind of see how it's measured by the government, more specifically the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS. We start out up here with the population. That's everyone. That includes children and retired people and everybody alive in the U.S. Break that down to the potential labor force. The potential labor force is the part of the population that is age eligible to work. Generally speaking, you have to be 16 years of age or older and not in an institution. That is really prison or a hospital. From the potential labor force, we bifurcate into the actual labor force and not in the labor force. The actual labor force is then bifurcated into employed and unemployed. So to be part of the actual labor force, you are either working or you're not working but actively looking for a job. You're ready to work, you're willing to work, and you are able to work. Not in the labor force means that you're not employed and you are not actively seeking work. So the people in here might be retirees, they might be full-time students, homemakers, and a variety of other examples. You can do calculations to get a sense of what this labor force participation rate looks like and watch how it changes over time. Now here, just for mathematical illustration, we've got January 2022 data. And the actual labor force was 163,687,000 in the U.S., and the potential labor force was 263,202,000. Effectively, what we're doing is we're taking the actual labor force and we're dividing it by the potential. This divided by this. Another way of thinking about it is what fraction of the potential labor force is employed or unemployed. Works out to 62.2. Now, if you want to look at data across time, you can pull up this link here, and let me see if I can do that. So this is from a site called Trading Economics, and they compile data, economic data, and you're able to create these various charts that show how it changes across time. And just for future reference, of course, you can also get a whole lot of other labor indicators on this site as well. But this is the labor force participation rate. So as of this video, the most recent information is July 2022, and we got 62.1%. Okay? Well, I think that was the same as what we had here, right? 62. No, it's 62.2. So it's about the same as it was, very minor change. But let's go back a little bit further. We've got 1 year. Let's go back 5 years, see if we see anything interesting. Well, this is interesting, and this is clearly the COVID pandemic, where labor force participation dropped from 63.5 all the way down to almost 60. 5 years, which I just did 10 years, 25 years. Now we're really starting to see a trend. In the past 25 years, it's pretty clear that labor force participation has dropped. And then if we go back as far as possible, which for this data set looks like the post-World War II period, looks like after World War II and well into the 60s and 70s, all the way up to the millennial, you see increasing labor force participation. But then something happened around the millennium that led to a decrease, and that's something we're going to talk more about. But it's an ongoing concern for economists that we're seeing less people involved in the labor market, because that affects our ability to produce. Resources are necessary to produce output, and if there's less resources producing, then there's less output. That can compromise our economic growth, and it can lower the incomes and standards of living of the country. So it's something to be aware of, and we want to obviously determine not only what's happening, but what's causing it. So we'll get into that later on. Labor force participation rates do vary across genders. So you'll notice up here, this data goes again from about 1950 to close to the present. Males have been participating less. Females have been participating more. A lot more after the war, and there's many reasons for that, but then it leveled off and dropped a little bit. But generally speaking, we can say men are participating less, women are participating more, and therefore the increase in the total up to this point here has been a result of women entering the labor force. Okay? And this is something that is continuing even to this day. Okay? It's called gender convergence. Men still have higher participation than women, but the gap is getting smaller.